All right, it's 6 o'clock. I see that people are still joining. So let's wait a little bit. If you don't hear me, so now I wave and say, do you hear me? Everything's fine. Just use the chat. Yeah. All right. All right. And try switching to another video. Just a second.
Is the sound better now? Oh, no.
Does it sound better now? All right. So let me switch to a better screen. So I really tried, but this is the first time I do webinar for Event Store. So bear with me. So I'm doing this magic trick. So how this is supposed to work? Yeah, screen share. All right. So welcome everyone to our first webinar. This is the introduction to event sourcing, not Event Store webinar. So as some of you know, I recently joined as dev advocate for Event Store. So this is my first effort to promote Event Store, but we feel that Event Store itself needs it won't be promoted without promoting event sourcing. I think event sourcing, or we all believe that event sourcing is the key for people to use Event Store effectively, because Event Store basically was born as a product to support event sourced application. So please use Q&A. I see the questions already coming. It's only white screen. Yes, I'm sorry about this. So let me do this properly. New share. Here we go. Is it better now on screen? I can start YouTube, yes. No, not that one. Please use chat for when you report echoes and stuff, because for Q&As it's kind of hard to comprehend. So I'm starting the YouTube stream now, just a sec. All right. And now I'm trying to it's the last bit. All right, never mind. Should be fine. So try this. So what is event sourcing? Event sourcing, I tried to find funny pictures. That's the funniest I could find. I guess I need Greg with the fish. Some of you probably saw these presentations by Greg long time ago when the example of shopping cart. It's roughly, I don't know, Adam, please advise me, maybe 12 years old, maybe older. And when Greg did the talk on DD Europe, decade of event sourcing. So I think it was 2 years ago, so it's 12 years now, 13. He said that's the last time he's going to show this. So I'm taking the estafette and showing this to you. It's the classic example of e-commerce. So sequence of events, cart created, 3 items added, 1 item removed, and shipping information added, and so on. So what does it all mean, this picture? So we are talking about moving away from storing the current state of entities or anything inside a system that is event sourced, and instead of doing that, we will store domain events. So domain events, as Eric Evans put it, it's a pattern of domain-driven design, but it's not limited to domain-driven design. It's basically saying that it's something that happens and domain expert cares about it. So this is quite a bit different from what people think about events in general. So like there are events that could be representing something like transaction log in a database is basically a big event log, but it doesn't represent anything inside the domain. It doesn't have any business meaning. So domain events in contrary represent something that has a business value and business meaning. So state mutations represented as something meaningful. It also basically represents on the timeline the history of changes and state mutations in a system. Events are stored in append-only fashion, so you cannot delete them as such. Well, you can discuss that. And normally you append it only, and you cannot modify them. That's a strict rule. So what happened is happened. You cannot change the past. It's like normal real life. So as soon as you store it, it's there, and you cannot modify it. And therefore, events are immutable. So they cannot be changed. Moving away from the shopping cart example, because it's pretty basic and a bit boring, although I will need to get back to it later. This is something that some of you would recognize. This is the tracking of the DHL waybill. So you can see that basically, yes, you are interested in the current state where your package is, but you also want to see how it got there. Sometimes, especially when it gets misrouted. So I got several situations when my package was flying back and forth between Amsterdam and Düsseldorf, and it never got to me. So, and because I knew the history of things that happened with my package, I was able to call DHL and say, what's going on? So are you going to deliver it, or you just want to play ping pong between Amsterdam and Düsseldorf? forever. And eventually they broke this cycle and somehow manipulate the system so the package was routed properly at the end. Sometimes it gets to customs and gets stuck there and they don't even let you know, so you need to watch it yourself and call the customs office to get it cleared. Mic level, I can try. So is it better now with the mic level? I hope so. So this is a classic. I don't know if DHL is event sourced, but I know that they store history of all the movements for the package in some sort of log. And this gives the very interesting view on the history of the delivery. So one way of doing this kind of system is basically event sourcing it, because everything here represents a clear domain event. So as you can see, the arrival sort facility and processes for clearance and clearance event, they even call it an event, custom status updated. All of this, something happened in the past tense, is clearly representing the main event. So I look at several delivery companies and they all have a log like this. And clearly this state transitions for the package are represented as an event usually. This is another example. I'm sorry for the image quality. It is the best I can find. It's first Banco Wiki, so apparently it's a sample image. Transactions on your bank account are represented as individual records. So Greg loves this example. He used it several times. So when you call your bank and apparently you find out that your account is empty or even in negative balance, and you know that it was a few $1,000s before or euros, and you call them and say, what's going on? And they say, we don't know. It's a mighty table of the account balance that tells me that you have a negative balance. It's never going to work, right? So you need to know how you got there. And by looking at the transaction log, you find out what was going on your account. Someone stole your money, or you eventually just went overboard and bought an expensive TV or even a car. The same applies for counting and many other domains. I keep hearing that event sourcing is a niche technology or niche pattern. Actually, it's not, because a lot of businesses keep track on the history of things that happened in their business, especially when it's actually their core domain, like we call it in domain-driven design, something that matters. So if we look at state-based persistence, we only know one thing, it's the current state. So if you look at a relational database in a table or a document database like Mongo or even key value store database, you have an ID of the entity, you load this ID, you query it, you get it by the key, and the current state of the entity is the only thing you know. The current state is the only thing you see. But you don't know many other things, like what it was before the last state mutation, why the state has mutated, and what happened throughout the history of the life cycle of this entity. And interesting thing that we often forget, what didn't happen. Like if you look at the state, what you can't see there, and maybe it's a bit confusing, so I'm showing you some examples. So what didn't happen, like shopping cart, I'm getting back to shopping cart example. Shopping cart has been created. Maybe the user just started to add things. It is implicit action. And $1,000 item was added. And then eventually the cart expired because the customer never checked out. So imagine the e-commerce system that would delete expired shopping carts, then you would have complete data loss. In case that the shopping cart stays just marked as expired, you can find out that the item was there. So it's a better situation. Fine, so you can probably solve it like this. So it's expired, but the item is still there, and you can start nagging the customer, are you going to buy this or not? But what about this? The shopping cart was created, then $1,000 item was added. and then it was removed, and the $20 item was added, and then the customer checked out. In a state-based system, you basically see that there is a shopping cart with $20 item, and they checked out, and you're happy you got $20. What you didn't know, and you don't know, you're never going to find out until you start keeping some sort of log or audit log, that the customer actually looked at much more expensive item, and he probably or she wants to buy it, but apparently that's not a good time. Or I don't know, you need to wait for until the paycheck arrives. So maybe the wife stands behind them. It's like, what are you doing? It's like, let me quickly remove it and then add less expensive item, but I really want that one. So there is a lot of information in history that disappears if you don't keep it. So there are a number of benefits of event sourcing, and I'm actually not going to go through them. It's probably another discussion that I'd like to have with many of you. So we'd like to collect some feedback after this webinar, what you would like to discuss. Dave, our CEO, discovered or formulated 12 benefits of event sourcing, and the log of state mutation is one of them. I know it's controversial because there are voices in the community saying that's not exactly the log, and I'm not trying to sell you event sourcing as the log system. That's what Kafka does, and we are not Kafka, so I'm not going to lie to you. And the reason why we do event sourcing is not only to keep the logs. So imagine things that you just need to look at the past and do some data analysis. Imagine that you want to do real-time event processing, but also keep events in place just for the case that you don't even know about at the moment. So there are many things that you could figure out when you actually have a history of changes. Sometimes it's very useful to understand what was going on in order to figure out why are you having this particular state of this entity right now. So I worked at the e-commerce company, or like say ERP, more or less a small-scale ERP system, when I had a few SQL scripts that we executed when some sort of misalignment between warehouse current balance on one side and something else on the other side was happening. I worked there for 3 years, and we never figured out the cause of this. So we were never able to fix the bug, but we knew where to look to find a problem and fix it. But we were never able to identify the root cause of the problem. So with the event source system, it would be very easy to do. Things like predictive analysis and behavior analysis would be pretty easy to do with event source systems. So don't get me wrong. So you can, of course, store events like that was updated, or you can have a status history. So if you look at the right side, I just took random screenshots from the internet. So you can see the status of something has changed from open to canceled. So, but what has happened? You don't know. I mean, it was canceled by support, so you probably can understand that someone from support eventually decided to cancel something that was open before. You don't actually understand. And somehow from protest, it was open. You don't know the business reason for that event to happen. So keeping just status updates, or like saying this property changed the value from this to that, it doesn't give you enough information because it misses the essence of it. So basically the business reasoning behind a particular decision that was taken by support@esms.com. However, on the left side, you see that the status is still getting updated, like for example, shipped and download and stuff like that. But it was updated because the item was shipped and it was downloaded and stuff like that. So you don't even know. I mean, this third line is order has been downloaded. It tells you information that has a business meaning, and you know what's going on. So you know why it happened. Maybe you look at more properties in that event and you can find out a little bit more than just a simple status update. So people tend to have this idea in mind that you can implement event sourcing with so-called property sourcing. That property, or even making an event, it's called property updated. It's actually not going to solve any of your issues. If you have a dream building event source system, stick to the main events that have business meaning. So entity as event stream, as I see it, is I repeated several times during a couple of talks and hands-on sessions. Basically, for the first time, we have this ability to, instead of keeping the current state of the entity and basically orient the whole system or the subsystem to keep the state, we also can keep the behavior, because events represent behavior. They do not represent, not always represent intent, because we have actions and we have consequences. So we call consequences events, so they represent state mutations, but it's not necessarily the case that everything that user or someone else does with their system produces an event. For example, if you can't do certain things, you might decide not to proceed with the action. So you have a command coming from the user, and you say, no, you can't do that because your date of birth is not correct, or you haven't filled out a password, or something else is missing. So you might decide a store event about that as well. It's a pretty useful pattern. But to have a full audit log, you basically need to store all the commands and all the events, and then you have full observability of the history of things. But you can persist the behavior of persisting events. So you have things that happened and the user has, or other systems entered your system and basically produce some behavior. And this behavior results in the state mutation in the system. So in event source, state mutation is a consequence, is something that's recorded as an event, and then the states get mutated. So we store entities in event store systems as event streams. And we tend to use a single stream of events. Basically, stream is a collection. We call it stream because it's like, adding at the end. That's just a popular name as well, right? The stream name, if you want to store entity as an event stream, you just need to give it some sort of ID, right? So the stream name is basically the ID of the entity. If you look at Mongo database, you have the document ID in a collection. So collection might represent your entity type, and the ID of a document is the random GUID. In the relational database, it's similar. So you have a table and you have an incremental int or GUID as an ID. So here we also do that. We don't have collections. We don't have partitions in event store in particular, but we can combine the things to formulate the ID. It's very similar to key value stores. So you can use entity type hotel book in this case and its ID. I just chose the int as an ID to fit the screen, unlike the GUID. And this is your stream name. And then every state mutation is represented as an event. So it's reserved, it's bugged, paid, it's canceled, whatever. And then you can look at the history and decide what to do further on and what to do with the customer. And how you get to the current entity state. So imagine that you need to execute a new command and you need to know what state of entity it is right now. So you basically load all the events. There are things there, I know, not getting there yet. But basically load all the events and apply them one by one. It sounds a bit of overkill, but it's not that hardcore. It's all these small state mutations of 1, 2 properties are very fast, and you load all the events at once. So in event store, we have max page size of events of 4,096. Usually in the normal business life cycle of an entity is limited to 1,000 events. So that's just an experience. And reading 1,000 events is not a problem. And each event has a version, so it starts with 0. When the entity just gets initialized, it's number 0, and then 1, 2, 3, and so on. It's often used to handle optimistic concurrency. If you work with entity framework or Hibernate and Hibernate, you know that you might add a column that's called version and you keep the version there. So if there will be conflicting changes, you can't do that because it will just say version doesn't match. You need to do it again. And by using versioning, if you try to apply the same event twice, it will say no because it's already there. So it makes the rights immutable and consistent. So appending events to the stream is a transaction. So you can add one or more events to the stream and it will be written in one transaction. So you keep your entity consistent. This is how you form your consistency boundaries technically. So this is all of event sourcing. I'm not going to go to CQRS and query models, so-called read models here because we won't have enough time because I still want to get to some discussion and we will touch the query side of event sourcing later, I mean in the next webinar. So I want to write some code and I don't know about the quality of the sound. It's really, I never experienced anything like that. I have a good mic and my connection is decent. So, okay, good. So apparently it's per person, I don't know. So now let's look at some code. Not there, in here. So I created, I'm sorry to everyone who is not a .NET developer, but I hope you can read this. So I created a very simple ASP.NET Core application, which has a very simple configuration and is completely empty. So I created the command API just to do the tests, and I use Swagger to just test the API. So if I close the slides, I don't have more slides to show, to be honest. I hope you're happy with this. So if I go to host 5000, I need to run this, of course. So here we go. That's basically a very small thing and it does nothing. So I'm going to continue and start adding stuff there. So I need to stop this application now. I'm not in dynamic language, so it needs to be compiled. And I'm going to work on some domain stuff. So let's say we have a simple entity for the hotel booking, right? So let's call it booking. And remember, don't ask again. And I will just for the sake of readability, I will enter the presentation mode. So what do we need to do in the booking? Let's say we want to, that's a proper domain entity. We can call it aggregate root or aggregate whatever. I just call it entity for the sake of not being involved with DDD that much. And let's say I want to keep the customer ID. I will not use value objects. Just forgive me for that. I don't have time for it. And I probably want to keep them private. So I'll just say string customer. And I want to keep maybe the hotel ID. And I maybe want to have some sort of status. I will create an enum. And paid, cancelled. And that's it. So maybe confirmed. So I will have the booking status and I will have whatever, maybe dates. Dates, time. From to. So, I mean, I don't want to make it very complicated. So, and then let's say I have, when I want to put my first reservation or create a booking, whatever, like let's call it book the hotel, I would create a method that's called book. I don't know what to call it. Create booking. Okay. I don't like create because it's cruddy, but still. So we would say we need the customer ID, and maybe we need first the hotel ID. And then we say daytime to. Very easy thing. So what we usually do, we just say from, and so on. So more properties. And what we do is let's go to the instruction, create something that I used to call aggregate store. Let's create an identifier first, just for the sake of it. And it would have basically two methods, so store and load, right? So I would say that it's store, and it will use an ID, or it will have store of T, so it's generic, T entity, and then it will have task of T load string. I will use string identities. I don't want to use ints or GUIDs, whatever. It's just a string. Keep it simple. So, and let's say I want to create an API that would just do the booking, right? So let's say book. And I would say, let's say we want to create proper commands. So let's say I want to create commands. And it will say have. Sorry for the typos. And so on. So daytime and stuff. And in the API, I would say that I need to do commands dot book, and I would just do something like that. So just bear with me. I should create an application service. I know, but just for the sake of it, I would keep it simple. So let's say public command API. And now I have access to the store. So I'm going to say, I suppose the booking doesn't exist. So I also need to have something like, they need to send me the ID. And I would say, okay, so I would create a new booking. And let's say booking dot, maybe I need to assign the ID first. All right, and then I create this booking ID and booking.create booking. And it would be command hotel ID commands. And I will need to create from to. So here we go. And what do we do? And let's say this is not this. We will have a sync. Never return primitive times from the API. It's bad practice. You haven't seen me doing that. So store booking. All right. Return done. So in a normal kind of state-based system, what I would do, and of course I need to add. So what would it do, like if my aggregate store is MongoDB document database or SQL Server, I will create ORM stuff with the entity framework, and I will create some tables, whatever, automatically, and then it will shovel this stuff to the table that's called booking, right? Or it will go to the booking collection and create a document. Anything else I do, like I will, the next command I do probably is to paid or confirm payment. I will just say, I call the method. Let's do that. So task, I will not return anything. Confirm. Pay, whatever. And if I create this one, of course, there must be price and stuff like that. I just copied this one and say, all right. So what I do, I would say booking, load, booking ID, and then I'd say booking, confirm payment to pay. And then I would say await store, save or store booking. And I can create a method there. Yeah, it will just do like so state mutations are executed like this. So you call a method on the entity and saying, do that, entity does it. So you have a proper domain model, let's say it like this, implemented in code. So you express your intent with proper methods. It has behavior, it has state, it's fine. The only thing that every time you just call store, sorry for that, it overrides the state. So you don't know what happened before. So how you do it event sourced. That's actually not hard. If we go and say that, let's say we need a bit of infrastructure here as well. So let's create a class called, let's call it entity. It's basically a base class. And we want this entity to collect events instead of just mutating the state. So how do we do that? So first of all, we need to have some sort of list of changes. And let's make it private. So I would say list of object changes. And every time you create a new instance of an entity, it should be empty because there is nothing there, no changes. So I'm going to to some of my code just to steal stuff. So we save some time, but I'm going to explain what I'm doing. We, of course, need some way to get an idea, but I will do it later. And then we need to apply the changes. So how do we do that? So let's keep the changes at the end and put this method in here. So basically, we receive an event in this method, so that we call apply. Every time we want to mutate the state, we will call this method. And then we add this object. Well, yes, something will come. It's a concrete class that will be coming, but they will all inherit from an object, so I can safely use it. Add it to the list of changes, right? So what is magical when method? When method is specific to the particular state mutation. So we will implement it soon, but now we just copy it. It's very simple. It's just doing nothing at all at the moment. It's a abstract void when, and it will be object event. All right, so all this apply does, it adds it to the list of changes and it calls the when. So the changes collection gets amended, but it's not being queried just yet. So that's why I see this warning here. So let's do that thing in our booking. So return to the booking. Okay, so no, we need to do some events, right? So let's do a class called events. Events are part of the main model. That's why I'm not putting them to the application. And here we go. It's basically a sort of namespace. I like to do it this way. Thanks, Sergio, for this tip. And it will be the class called book, booking booked. I don't want to do that. I will just call it created. And I will have this almost the same properties as in command. So here we go. So if you worry about writing a lot of code for commands and events, it's not that hard. It's basically, sometimes it's almost copy paste. And let's do the paid event. Sorry, guys, I don't really pay attention to the chat just because I love you all. And I will try to read it, but now I'm concentrated on finishing this. So I will say, oh, pay status. So we have two events, and now in our booking class, what are we going to do? Well, we're not going to mutate the state in the methods. Instead, we're going to raise an event. So we call apply. Oh yeah, of course. And now it says, look, you forgot the when, and we will do it later. But now we just say create booking. So what does it do? It does this: apply new booking, create it, and we put some properties in there. The booking ID is the ID. Hotel ID is coming from the parameters. From to. All right, here we go. So nothing more than that. And now for paid, we do the same. It looks meaningless because, you know, paid, it should be some business behavior. I'm just trying to show you the concept. So Okay, so we applied it, and our apply methods, what does it do? It just adds it to the list of changes and calls the when. So what our when will throw. So what do we do? Well, we'll fix it. So we will do the following. So we will use pattern matching to see what kind of events we got and if it's booking created. We will say case. Then we can amend the status or the state of our entity. So say, okay, here we go. It's the hotel ID equals events hotel ID. Sorry, Mac, customer ID. Customer ID from break. So now it will look like this. When we call this methods, and our API hasn't changed. It doesn't know about if your system is event sourced, it doesn't really care. That's why I'm saying transitioning from state-based management, state-based system to event source system from the API perspective, from application service perspective, is not that hard. Because as soon as you have proper abstraction on your entity store, you don't really care how it's stored. Event sourcing is just a persistence mechanism. If you looked, if you remember a recent Twitter discussion, like DDD doesn't work, only works with document store. It's a good joke. I really had a good laugh. So not a single line changed here, but it will still work. And let's do the second one. Case, it's a booking paid status break. All right then. So when we call this method create booking, for example, it will call apply. The apply will add it to the list of changes and call the when. Some would argue, why do you call when? Because you've still populated a list of changes, and basically, why do you need to care? Why do you need to mutate the state right here, right now, if you just store events and then next time you load it, then you call the when? I'd say it's pretty useful if you just say, what if from is more than, I mean, it's stupid, I know. You can just do the validation, it's the basic stuff, but there might be more complex rule and you actually execute several things at once and you produce multiple events. So then you really need to know, you don't want to repeat all this logic in that method. You might have some complicated events, reasonably complicated events, state mutations, and then you just need to work with the state of your object that is current after you applied an event. So that's why we always call a when in apply, and it doesn't cost. It's like nanoseconds, or I don't know what's less, nanosecond or microseconds. It's very fast. It's basically just executing a couple of assignments. So what did we gain from it? When we start persisting it, we will have events in our event stream, and I'm going to show you how it looks like. And we are heavily over time. So what happens when we load this entity? We need to create an aggregate store that will use event store for persistence. So it's logically called aggregate store, and implements aggregate store. So first thing we need to do is basically do that. So when we store events, it's pretty easy to do. You basically collect all the changes that you have in your entity, and that's it. So we need to change an interface that it knows. No, this one. And the same here. All right. And we implement the constraints over there as well. So now we can just go to the entity, and you can see that my entity has this. It needs a method, of course. The list of things here is private, so I couldn't get it from there. But what I can do is basically I want to hide my list just so nobody manipulates it outside of the entity itself, so I can return the changes as a read-only collection to the store. The changes, yeah, here we go. So basically this stuff has all the changes. That's what you need to keep. That's what you need to shovel to event store. So how do we do that? Basically, we have a collection of objects. We need to serialize them, right? Because event store and any other persistence works with serialized one way or another, serialized objects. It doesn't store objects. It needs to have a representation of it. So let's just for the sake of simplicity, let's choose JSON and do that. So if I go to my stolen code, I will just copy it. But it's still pretty small. So of course, in my stolen code, I use aggregate, and I'm not using it now. I'm going to import this, and it will be entity. And there will be entity version. Clear changes. So apparently we're missing something from the entity itself, and I will add it soon, and I will tell you why. And I will also copy the get stream name method, which is pretty useful. So when we store an entity, we need to know how the stream name is composed. So as I showed you in the slides, in this case, I use the type name and the entity ID. And that's it. So you can say, I don't want to have dependency on CLR types. You want to, or whatever language you use. On the type name, you can use something else. As soon as the entity can tell the store how it's called, you can just deduce it from the entity or make the entity produce a name for it. But here I use just a simple string concatenation. So the version needs to be there, and it's basically just an int. And I also mentioned it in the slides. This is for idempotency and optimistic concurrency. So we need to know where we are. And -1 is a default one because the first event you write is the stream doesn't exist. So it has the event you write will get version 0. And because it's incremental, you start with an empty stream and the version is -1. So we have the version, and I use the get stream name entity dot get ID. Apparently, I need to do that as well. So the store needs to know what ID it is. Therefore, I need to have this method. And it's an abstract one, so the entity needs to tell the store, my ID is that. We could also create a sort of a string property in the base class. I usually don't do it, just for the sake of encapsulation. So of course it now complains, and it's very easy to implement like this. All right then, what do we have left? It's a method, and yeah, of course, it needs the T. All right, so we want to clear, it's not necessary to clear changes, because if you follow the pattern of that every command execution only does one write, so this is the best practice, this is your consistency boundary, you want to execute one command and do the write and get out from your API or whatever edge you use. But in case of, just to avoid mistakes, you don't want to keep doing something with the entity and then store it again and keep old changes. So you want to clear it when you store it, so there will be no changes in the array. So clear changes is pretty easy to do. I need to, yeah, it's here. I just need to clear the list. So what this magic is here, connection. Here we go to the real instructor. This is why we are from event store. We want to use event store, right? So first of all, event store operates with something called event store connection. So event store connection is a singleton. It's initialized once in the application, and as you can see, it's not initialized here, so I need to pass it to the constructor. What I'm going to do, and it will be bootstrapped in the startup. Now, the connection doesn't have append event methods because it's a bit more complex. It needs to do serialization and stuff. So, but this is the essence of it. So you check if it's null or not, you get a stream name, you get your list of changes, and then you somehow store it somewhere in the store that can just add events to the stream. I use extension method that I'm going to copy in a moment just to simplify the code, so you can see that it's not that hard, it's just 5 lines of code, including throwing an exception. So it's not rocket science at all. So I'm going to create a small class. I'm just going to copy the whole thing. Event store extensions. I'm going to spend a bit of time explaining what it does. And I need to copy event metadata. I don't need metadata, just I want to keep it to show it to you. So this is the extension method. It's also very simple and very small, although my font is large, so it doesn't really fit to the screen, but it's just 40 lines of code, including curly braces and empty lines I'm going to delete. And it uses JSON.NET to serialize. You probably don't want to do that, but it's bloody slow, but everyone uses it, so I keep using it too. It doesn't do much. It gets a stream name and get a version, get a list of events. It checks if there are nothing to save, it just gets out. And event store needs to sort of put it in some sort of container. Every event puts in a container that has a type of event data. It's very similar to things like Event Hub, for example. They also use event data. I think it's called even like that, but we were first to call it event data. And it has certain parameters. So the constructor needs an event ID, which is, since we generate new events all the time, it's just a nucleate. The type, I use a CLR type. It's a bad practice. You need to map it to strings, but we're not going to cover it. It's more advanced stuff. Using CLR type is kind of fine for its start. And we just serialize an event and serialize event metadata. So just a brief touch on event metadata, you can put whatever you want. It's a dictionary. It's a basically key value, string to string. So you can put stuff like when the command was received, what is the user identity that sent this command. You can put a trace ID if you do distributed tracing, a lot of different stuff in metadata. Metadata is something that doesn't have any business meaning, but it has value for the tech. So for you as a developer, and you want to have things like observability and stuff, you put it in metadata. Don't put this stuff in event itself. Event just consolidates the business essence of the state mutation. So again, not hard. I can just shrink it to 10 lines of code if I want to, losing some readability, and that's it. Just need to close some windows later on. So now we have everything, so we can actually store stuff. And if I just return task of T, what would I return? My T is not, I can't new it. So let me just use some codes to instantiate it, and we will go and store it without using the load just yet. From results. So we'll just, it's a fake code, so don't look at it. I just want to make it work. So now we need to wrap it up. We need to put aggregate store because it has our command API has a dependency, but it's not wired. So if I run it, dependency injection will complain, and I'm going to solve it in the startup file by putting this dependency in the container. So I have the connection string in the settings file. So you can see it's going to connect to localhost with default credentials. Never put default credentials in production, although I know a few people who do that, myself included. Don't do it. Don't look at me. So we have the configuration in place. It's nice. So I can just instantiate the connection. So how do we do that? Where is it? Here. So let's keep Swagger at the end. And here's my connection, right? So event store connection class comes from the client. It is event store client API library on NuGet. So it has been installed here. So you can see here, I don't need Mongo, sorry. And this is it. So I need to supply connection string. There are a bunch of ways to instantiate the connection. We're working to reduce the number of ways to do that and document it better. But this is the simplest way, and it will work out of the box. So let's say I call the connection webinar, because then it will look nice in the user interface. And this is my connection. So what I'm going to do with this, I will instantiate a new aggregate store or entity store. Entity aggregate. I call it aggregate store. Oh, Jesus Christ. Aggregate. I call it entity everywhere. And here I call it aggregate store. And I just pass it a connection. So, and then I would just say services at Singleton. No, I don't want to. No, yes, I want to do that, of course, at Singleton. No, that's wrong. So, right, now it's correct. So I registered it, but it won't work. Why won't it work? Because creating connection is not enough. You need to also tell it to connect. So it doesn't work like that. It's configuration code, but also runtime code that will need to start after the configuration. That's why we don't do any kind of real instructor inside the configure service method. People who work with .NET Core know that. At least I hope you don't. So how are we going to do that? So we need to open the connection at the start and close the connection when our application shuts down. So we're going to use application service or hosted service for that, and it's pretty easy to do. I create this one, and I don't need any projections. Hosted service, and I don't need any of this, and I can just simplify it, return in task, and here we go. So this is the very easy hosted service. The only thing it does when the application starts, it starts to open the connection using connect async method, and when the application stops, it closes the connection. Now it will work when we register the hosted service. So I just say services add hosted. And you see, it needs the connection. So the easiest would be actually not do that and use the dependency injection magic, which I don't really like, but in this case, it's pretty useful. Add Singleton ES connection. So you can see ES connection has a type of event store connection. Now I can say services add Singleton. What's it called? I aggregate store. If I'm not mistaken. Set to service T implementation. That's okay. Otherwise, it will complain anyway on runtime. Yeah, and I need to add hosted service event store hosted service. Now it should work. Let's see. All right. So it somehow missed the Swagger, so I did something wrong. Support ambiguous. Oh yeah, I guess I made a mistake in API. It has a book and pay, and it has probably no HTTP post, and it has route pay. Let's see if this works now. There we go. All right, so let's do the book stuff. Try it out. Booking ID 123. And it won't work for the simple reason that it will blow up. And the reason for that is if we look at the error, is that it tries to append to stream and it doesn't work for a simple reason that the connection cannot be opened because I haven't started event store. I could say this is intentional, it wasn't, but that's easy to fix. Event store webinar. Yeah, and I will just do Docker compose up. All right. So you see a lot of stuff. There is also MongoDB, which I use for projections, which we can do in the next webinar. And now I'm going to execute it. And here we go. Everything is fine. And success is success. And let's see what happened in Event Store and have a look at Event Store itself. So localhost. And if you remember the default credentials, I do. this is how it looks like. We don't like it too. Sorry to those who worked with Event Store and don't like this dashboard. We're going to fix it in the next version. But so far so good. We're going to just use. And what can I do with that one? Q&A thing. It's stuck. Okay. Yeah, it's gone. All right. So a lot of things are going on, but we're not going to look at it. We're going to look at the stream browser. And here you go. Recently created streams, booking 1 to 3, booking created. This is our event. Off you go. Everything is here. So this is our metadata that I put there, full CLR type, just for to put something there. And this is the event ID, the new GUI that we generated, and whatever else we want. Everything is saved. Now let's do the payment stuff. Let me check if it actually is implemented. So I go to the API, pay, blah, blah, good. So, of course it will blow up because I haven't implemented the load stuff. So we can create as many bookings as we want, but it won't be able to do anything else. So let's do that first. All right, so load. Of course, it won't blow up because it will return an empty entity, but that's what we want. So what we really want is to actually load stuff. And we're going to do it. The load method is actually pretty nasty. I mean, it's not that bad. It's still just a few lines of code, but it's a bit longer than the save. So I need to fix some stuff. I really do that quickly. Get stream name of, yeah, of course. And this is basically it. So let me make it async. So if we go through this, don't ignore the errors. We just throw if we get invalid argument, we get a stream name using the same method as we used in save, so it will turn the same thing. A user reflection, you don't need to do that. You can just say my entity can be newed by calling constructor. Then you read events forward from the beginning of times. So this is the stream name. This is the initial position, which is 0. This is the maximum page size to read is 1024, is basically 1K events. And this parameter is called resolve link tos. We don't need to discuss that now. And this is it. The issue with that code, if someone has noticed, that it only reads 1024 events. And if your stream has more events than that, first of all, you probably need to do something else, like snapshotting and stuff, but it won't actually load the whole thing. So if you have long streams, you need to implement paging. It's pretty easy to do, just a normal one while stuff. So the page actually returns you if it has more events. Page dot is end of stream, so you can just do the while and read it, and it has next event number and stuff. So in some of the webinars that will happen later, we can go through this and implement it properly. That's good enough. We only have one event at the moment, so we don't need to page anything. So apparently I'm missing 2 things. Result event is something that events to return to me. And it's, of course, the property bag that contains just binary arrays for data and for metadata. And it has some properties like event type, version, and stuff like that. So serialize it when we save, so we need to deserialize it when we load. That's pretty logical. So I need to just copy this stuff. It is extension method, you can see. So we're just going to copy the whole thing. Nothing fancy. Deserialize metadata. Get the data type of the CLR type of the event from meta, because I'm not doing anything else. I'm just doing straight simple. And deserialize the data using the given type over here. So use deserialize object. This is a string from binary array, and we return an object. Straightforward, nothing fancy, usual serialization, deserialization stuff. So now we solve that one. And then entity load. Entity load is a bit more interesting. So now we need to, we have read the whole stream of events. Let's say we read 10 of them, and then we need to restore the entity to current state. As I mentioned in the slides, we need to apply or like do the state mutation for each of those events. It sounds scary, but it's really fast because you see in this when method, it's very small. So the entity load method is also pretty straightforward. And it can be put in the base class because it's the same for everything, for all of this derived classes. So here we go. That's it. So this is the essence of event sourcing. If you look at it, this is the left fold that Greg's talked about so many times. Get all events and apply one by one, increase the version. So when you put a new event, it will have a proper version, the current version +1, and then +1, and then +1. So I don't know what can be simpler than that. Nothing. I think it's pretty straightforward. So when you receive one event now that's called booking created, and you have one element in the collection, you call it when, the when will say, okay, let's go here, booking created, it will mutate the state, and that's it. So this is all event sourcing, to be honest. So let's go to aggregate store. All our methods are now implemented, so we can do the base stuff. And of course, I need to restart it. So let me just go out to the presentation mode. Oops. And stop it. So here we go, we run it, and it will open Saga again. I don't need it, I have it here. And our, what was that? 1, 2, 3. So let's try to do bad stuff. So let's try to say booking ID is 234 and paid is true. I execute it and it should crash, and it did. So, yeah, I need a constructor. It's crashed, but for the different reason. Let me do the constructor. Oh, it needs an ID, right, yes, okay. So I will do it like a private one. Let me just double check with event with aggregate store. What does it use, Chris? Yeah, it should be fine. Working. So let's try it. All right. It's good. And it worked. It shouldn't actually work because it should crash because it couldn't load it, but maybe I made a mistake somewhere. So let me see what happened in the stream browser. Yeah, booking with empty ID. Yeah, right. So I should have checked in my API if the entity that I return actually exists. So in here, what I do, I create a new one, and then it just reads a stream. It doesn't check if the stream actually exists. So it just says the entity is there, I created it, so I get stuff, and I try to load it, but because stream is empty is fine. So I could check here if the page is empty and throw. I can do other things. I can create an exists or new property on the entity itself. I can also compare the version. So I can say in the booking here, in confirm payment, for example, if version equals -1, I can create a function that will do it. So I'll just say throw new valid operation exception must exist. It's not the best way to do that. I advise you not to do it like this, but it will do the job for now. Right then, just do it again. And now it crashes, so it says must exist. So that's cool. And we say 1, 2, 3, execute, and it goes well. And if we look at the stream browser, I messed up. And I know where. So what you probably can guess. So if you look at the stream browser, it doesn't get a proper ID because the ID field is empty when we load it. So what we need to do in here, in when, in booking, we could have done it in the constructor as well. So we could separate creation of the booking and the actual factor booking by, like, you shouldn't call the constructor, you say use the static factory methods that will also generate an event that indicates that a booking has been sort of draft booking has been created. And then we actually do that. It's something like the active booking. I just don't like the booking booked and stuff like that. It doesn't sound nice. So maybe I need to choose another domain for the demo, but it's very easy to solve. So I just say ID equals events dot booking ID. And that's all I need to do. This is how bugs in event source system usually solved. Of course, ID bug is very nasty, so you don't really need to do that. But say it's another field, and somehow it got messed up. By fixing the implementation of the man method, you fix all the logic, also that happened before. So everything that starts now after you deployed a new version will actually work correctly if you change the logic, because as soon as your events were saved correctly, no matter how messed up the state mutations are, it will actually start applying the state mutations properly as soon as the new version of the application is deployed. So let's try to do it again. Boom. So I guess it's 200K now. So this stream doesn't get populated with anything new, and nothing happens here. Did I even run it? Yes, I did. Oh. So what happened? It's the demo effect, and it couldn't all go well, right? So let me just go like this. And click here, and it crashes. Oh, I think it doesn't. It's not running. That's the simple one. There is no bug. So I'm getting tired of this track of windows. Now, yes, something happened. Because before it was just refreshing the page. And here's the new event, booking paid, and everything is fine. So as you can see, it actually got the booking ID correctly and stuff like that. So I can easily prove to you that when you call the payment methods, it actually gets the status or all the properties populated. So the state mutation has been executed. If I do it again, and I get here, so you can see that the customer ID is 123, hotel ID 234, the ID of the booking itself and its payment status. Everything is properly populated by calling the ones on the previous event and historical ones. So it all works nicely. So that's basically the end of the demo. We managed to store stuff, we managed to load it back, and we basically built a very simple event source application in rather limited period of time, I could also, let's see, status is not set, right? So it's clearly a bug. What I do in a state system, I would write the whole bloody thing to just go there and correct the status in my table that contains a minute in the records. Here, I wouldn't do that. I mean, if we go to the read side of the projection, that's probably required, or we can rebuild the projection. But here it's pretty easy to just say status. No, I need the status. No, I don't need the status, right? So just go here, say status booked. And here I would say status paid. All right. So I should have created the application service. That's probably a nice topic for the next webinar. Now I'm calling this from the API itself. It's not a best practice because if as soon as you move to another sort of APIs, you need to rewrite the whole thing or copy paste a lot of code. It's nice to have it an application service because you might go to messaging, whatever else. But the essence of it is that this interface is extremely simple. It loads and stores stuff. It's not a repository, right? So it doesn't represent really a collection of your whatever else entities or aggregates. It doesn't work like that, but it has no ability to query anything. It just can do two things. It loads and stores. And you can implement it in many different ways. You can do document database, you can do ORM, whatever else, but just as well, you can do it in event sourced way. But of course, if you do it like this, your application doesn't change. So everything stays the same. The methods stay the same, at least the calls and stuff like that. But inside, instead of using state mutations directly in the method that represents the behavior of the entity, you do differently. You do apply of the event and it gets added to the list of changes. And then you need to have a when where all the state pieces are mutated. So that's basically it. And the magic happens in this load method, which is here. And as I said, this is the essence of event sourcing as it is. Just loop through all events and call the event method. So easy, relatively. There are a bit of moving pieces. We can all discuss that later on in the feedback and Q&A. So we are at the end of the webinar, but I'm really happy to get your questions and Event Store. Let me do this nasty thing that's called marketing. And I'm going to use that. So there is a book out there that I wrote last year that's called Domain-Driven Design with .NET Core. It's a complete lie. Don't look at the title. It's basically a book about the basics of event sourcing, including projections and stuff. So I found it pretty useful. I got good feedback and I get reasonable thing here. I got one person saying that I'm using horrible coding practice. I'm returning the task instead of awaiting it. So yeah, it's horrible. All right. So if you're interested, go find it. But we will go through the series of webinars to talk more about how to do queries, how to avoid common pitfalls, what are the anti-patterns for event sourcing. We can go through the 12 benefits of event sourcing. You see it's actually true. And we can address all these concerns, or some of them most important concerns that people usually have. And we can, of course, discuss if Kafka can be used as an event store. So now it's time for a little Q&A. So let me just put my face back and let me see if we have Q&A. So I don't really see, oh, here we go. Yeah, a lot of questions. So let me remove complaints about my mic. What is the difference between event store and event source? I'm not quite sure what you mean by event source. Event store is the place where you store events. This is the generic term. If you say event store with capital E and S, it's our product. So this is a database that's specialized to store events in a way that basically was designed to comprehend event source systems. So I would answer that. And I'm not sure if our YouTube channel work. It should be. I haven't checked. So I think my colleagues were on that. I hope at least. So if event store is immutable, but potentially you can have events in the past, business just forgot to add something that could be some calculations. After adding events in the past, all calc should be rerun. Immutability doesn't matter. Well, immutability has its benefits, and the benefits are actually tremendous. So by looking at the history of events that you persisted, you can guarantee to a certain extent, of course, that this is what actually happened. If someone forgot to add calculations, it doesn't, I mean, you're probably missing a property in event or whatever else, but this is what you've got. So there are a bunch of patterns how to address things like wrong contracts, missing data and stuff. So Greg wrote a book about event versioning that doesn't really talk about event versioning only, but it also explains how to do certain things like migrations, rewriting history as such, deliberately, with intent to rewrite history and stuff. So a lot of good advice over there. So you probably want to read it. It's on LeanPub. It's called Event Versioning by Greg Young. So, oops, yes. I mean, if you still have concerns, we can discuss that later on in the Slack channel. That I will give a link later on where to go. How do you name streams? I already answered that. Usually it's entity type name dash entity ID. Sometimes if you have multi-tenancy and you don't have the multi-tenancy embedded in Event Store as a product, like we don't, then you use prefixes, stuff like that. So you can, it's basically anything. The only thing is that it needs to be somehow, by looking at the entity class or module, if you use function language, entity type, and its ID, you need to be able to reproduce the stream name. That's all you need to know. So how do you deal with strong consistency when you're using Event Store? Basically, I don't know how we deal with that. Event Store is strongly consistent. So every write is transactional. So your entity, let's move to DDD terminology. Your aggregate as such is the transactional boundary. So everything you do inside your aggregate is by definition consistent. So we go to eventual consistency with event sourcing only when we talk about projections and read models, query models, if you want to call it this way. But this is not about what I showed you. The stuff I wrote is strong, consistent. There is no difference between any other store in that regard. So all your writes are strongly consistent. So what do you think? Demo on GitHub. Well, the book that I just showed you has the repository on Pact Publishing GitHub organization, so you can find it there. I think you just search me in GitHub, you'll find the link. I think it's pinned. So if you couldn't find it, just reach me out on Twitter, and I will give you the link. And it's much more comprehensive code, so it has projections and stuff. So, but there is also basic code like this. What IDE I'm using? I'm using JetBrains Rider. So because I'm on Mac, I can only use Visual Studio for Mac, which I don't really like, and VS Code, which I also don't really like. I mean, for C# development. So if entity is the main object, why should it depend on the mechanism of state construction and not backwards? Well, it doesn't really depend. Again, in my book repo, I showed, in my book code, I showed how I use events, but I don't use event sourcing as such. So I saw implementations when people publish events to the bus because the main events can be used as integration mechanism. But then you get the situation of distributed transaction because in structure piece that stores your entity state, in structure piece that transport events through the wire are two different distinct pieces. So then you get to the problem when you actually cannot guarantee your consistent writes. So imagine that your messaging structure suddenly fails, or just in between saving your state and publishing an event, your service crashed. So what then? Some other pieces of your system will miss this information. So with Event Store, you don't have this problem. You can, because all events are saved, you can just read them out, subscribe to them, and publish integration events, if you will. So, I mean, yes, it's a bit a different implementation of the entity itself. But this is how it is. So yes, the main objects sometimes I mean, it mutates the state. It controls its own invariants. It protects itself from being inconsistent. So the way you do it slightly changes, but the main essence is still the same. So it's not that different. So at the end, you just, instead of mutating the state in the method itself, you just raise an event. So yeah. Maybe it's better to add an event to the list of changes after calling when. Well, maybe, but when is a dumb method? When is doesn't do any checks. So you should never actually do some controls or preferably not even calculations. So it's pure state mutations. You get a property of an event and put it in the state of your entity. So if you have some ifs and buts in there, it's really not a way to do that. You need to avoid this because all this logic needs to stay in the method itself. So it's not in the when. When is very dumb. Imagine your business logic has changed and you have new events and maybe new versions of events. You don't really want to change your whens unless you have a bug. So bugs are basically the only reason why you would change your when. For all the rest, don't do that, please. So yeah, it's not VS Code, it's Rider. So it's already sharper functionality. The question was what VS Code plugin extension is used for refactoring. It's not VS Code, it's Rider. So you said for simplicity, we use JSON to serialize events in the real world application. Would you use different serialization format to persistent events? And if yes, why and what format? It all depends on your use case. JSON is perfectly fine if the number of events you have is not really overwhelming, because serialization can add a certain performance decrease. So if you don't have tons of events in your streams, probably you don't need to care. I would just not use JSON net to serialize. You might use system JSON or UTF-8 JSON in that regard. So there are a lot of, well, not a lot, but a couple of better serializers that can store still serialize to JSON. The only problem with JSON as such is its size. So if you're concerned about, remember, it's append only, everything gets stored unless you set time to leave on events, on event streams, or you delete streams after a certain period of time, defeating the purpose of event sourcing as such. Then you would have an always growing database. So you need to take care of the persistence at some point. So in production environments and heavily used production environments, it easily gets over terabytes of spaces. The space is cheap now, so I wouldn't care that much. But still, you might have concerns like this. So in that regard, you can choose protobuf, for example. Protobuf has this advantage because it's also easier to distribute contracts because it's less dependent on the language that implements it. So you distribute protofiles, and any language can generate their own implementation for it. Also, in the next version of Event Store, we moved to gRPC. So therefore, protobuf has more sense basically to use it because that's the same thing. You lose the ability to look at events. So if you if you remember, you look at the screen here. This only works with JSON. So if you don't have JSON, and I have this thing in aggregate store that persists events, somewhere here, I say, is JSON true? It tells event store that it can actually try to show it as a JSON. JSON is just a string, right? So if you use protobuf, you won't be able to do it. So this is something you will lose. So I would say you can definitely start with JSON and stay with it until you feel comfortable. So you don't need to look at the UI to understand what's going on. So let's move forward. I disagree more or less with the statement your API doesn't need to know about event store change of a store change. Of course, in your example, it's true, but in my experience, event stores DD security systems are fundamentally different from normal CRUD systems. Yeah, look, I didn't mention CRUD systems whatsoever. So if you do CRUD, it's very different, of course, because you wouldn't have entities that have behavior. So you would have simple state mutations somewhere in the API or in your application service. So yes, I agree that the CQRS systems or DDD-oriented systems with reach and behavior reach domain model, like it should be, are very much different. What I mean is that if you implement it this way, so you have reach domain model with behavior, then you basically load your aggregate or entity from the store, whatever the store it is, call a method on that entity and store it back. And in this regard, changing from event source or non-event source state-based system to event source system is, in that sense, an application service or the API is pretty easy to do. So I completely agree that you cannot. So the question continues. I cannot imagine having to transition an old-fashioned CRUD system to event source while keeping the public interface the same. Yeah, I completely agree. There is no doubt about that because simply the CRUD-based systems implements 4 operations like the name suggests: create, read, update, delete. So what do? Update this, update that, and you will have events, like I said, anti-pattern, property sourcing, that changed, this changed, and stuff like that. So don't do that. I completely agree. So I was comparing implementation of a proper or an application that uses a proper domain model that expresses the behavior, but it uses some sort of document database or entity framework or whatever ORM tool you use compared to the event source system. So then application API surface might just stay the same. I hope I answered the question. Why should the connection be singleton? Well, this is specific to event store, right? So event store opens in this particular case. I use event store 5. It uses TCP protocol. It connects once and uses a single TCP connection to the server to do all the things. You can open multiple connections, but I mean, you saw that it opens at the start, it finishes at the end, so it doesn't reconnect all the time. It keeps the connection open. So that's why it's singleton. It follows the application lifecycle. So is it absolutely thread stable? A lot of loads? Yes, it is. So we have very heavily loaded applications in production, and we never had this problem. It actually doesn't work otherwise. You could not just go connect and disconnect all the time. It just takes too much time. Would it be possible to implement several overloaded implementations when to accommodate multiple events without having? Yes, of course. Yes, we do that all the time. You can have a dictionary or hash map or matching the event type to a method, and then you can have multiple whens. Definitely completely possible. How you implement your when is up to you. So before it was, I mean, in famous m/r repository by Greg, there was some dynamic stuff going on, and now it's solved by a simple switch statement. If you don't find it clean enough, just use whatever you want. You can also go to the state immutability, so you can have a state object decoupled from the logic, so you represent your logic in a functional way as a set of static methods or functions as such. If you use F#, you can do it in C# as well. In my book, in chapter 13, I do that. So it's basically a set of functions that take a piece of immutable state and produce a new piece of state. And then whens become a bit different. It can be converted to a switch expression in that regard instead of using a switch statement. So, is there an article about 12 benefits of event sourcing? We are working on that. It will be on the website if it's not there yet. So, and we will discuss that on one of the consecutive webinars. What systems do you advise upfront not to apply event sourcing? Well, systems that do not, I mean, if you look at TDD and types of domains, right? You have core domain, you have supported generic subdomains, you have supported subdomains that are not generic. So usually people apply event sourcing in core domains where there is some movement and meaningful state mutations over time that have business meaning. So if the system doesn't, like, look at the user management story, it doesn't necessarily need to be event sourced. I mean, everything that precedes registration of the user is probably interesting to event source. Like someone gets into your website and then they want to register, they decide not to, and this kind of facts you want to comprehend, you want to record them. But for example, when the user has finally registered, maybe you don't want to follow this life cycle in event source system. But you might event source the user profile, but username and password, storing password in an event is basically very bad. Don't do that, please. And so if you have a timeline and you have decision making and you have business processes involved and you want to understand what's going on and you predict that these decisions in the past that have been made make sense for you to keep, then you would rather use the event source system. So, and more practice you get, the easier for you to start. Sometimes you start to see it as a silver bullet. You start to event source everything. Then you see that, like, why did I do that? I don't want to do that. It's just a bloody document. And it's a CRUD system. So, yeah. Time, when the time is important, when the decision making is important, when there is a logic that is not that easy to understand, and there is a processes involved, then you probably want to use event sourcing. Do I need a relation database like SQL Server if I use event store? Well, yeah. Proper consultant answer would be it depends. But so what I showed you is how to store and load a single entity. You can imagine that if I would say I want all the bookings that I paid, I would have a hard time to get it from event store because I would need to load all the events and reconstruct the entity state for each one of them, and it will take ages. Of course, I can do tricks like I could read all events that say booking paid, and then also read all events that booking refunded or cancelled, and then I can understand what bookings have been paid. And if I want to have this query by like last week, then I will really have a hard time. So that's why we use read models, the query side of CQRS that we're going to touch later. And you need some place that you can query. And the postulate of CQRS that your need for writes, the consistent writes, are drastically different from your need for reads. Not always, but most of the time. And we will discuss that in one of the next webinars. What is the mismatch between reads and writes, and how to address this with read models and with CQRS. So, and you need a place to keep your read models, and it needs to be queryable store. Not always, because if you have a cache, for example, it could be a key value store, but most of the time you need a queryable store. And then you can use whatever you want: SQL Server, Postgres, MongoDB, Cosmos DB. As soon as you can query it, you can use it. But to store events, you don't need SQL Server. I'm not using SQL Server, as you can see. Would you write MVP of some product using event-sourced approach? Well, yeah, I would, but it depends. So I know that Adam was here, at least at the start. He'd say yes, definitely do everything. With event sourcing, you use event modeling to understand your domain, collaborate, and yeah, if you get more practice, then event sourcing has its advantages. That you can split the work. Someone is working on read models, someone is working on command implementation, so someone is working on API as such. This is not related to event sourcing really. So API can be separated in any system. But so the only thing that I encountered when I was working on the core domain that I'd like to event source, and I thought that was a mistake. And the situation was the following. So, well, there are a couple of cases. First case was that we underestimated the impact of the legacy system. So we had to import massive amount of data in a batch fashion and convert it to events. It didn't really work well. So we ended up looking at different approaches, combining event sourcing and just writing to read models, integration read models as such. So this being said, that event sourcing is one of the very good ways to deal with legacy systems, which we need to touch separately. So it's out of the scope for this webinar. Another case was that apparently business didn't know what to do. And developers just followed the business and followed their advice and were really sure that they did the right thing. And at the end, they found out that none of it makes sense. So event sourcing, due to immutability and kind of harder way to change the past, it needs you need to apply certain patterns to move from one scheme, let's say that is of events, one set of events to another set of events. And if you expect that your business will drastically change over time when you're doing MVP and you're going to do a lot of pivoting, then it might be not exactly the right choice because of the complexity involved in moving the scheme forward, not by adding a couple of fields in that event, this event, and call it a day, or introducing a new version, but basically rewriting half of your application. Then probably you need to experiment with something else and at least figure out the real deal, the real product that you're going to build, and confirm that's going to work. And then somehow migrate to the event sourcing. Migrating from non-event source system, again, properly done, preferably with CQRS, is no-brainer, to be honest. So, but sometimes you really, if you feel that your business doesn't know what to do, feel they're lost, you ask questions they don't know how to answer, then you might get in trouble. So, unfortunately, the number of questions doesn't shrink, so every time it's on 16 or 17. We really need to wrap up soon, so I'd suggest we have 6 more minutes, 5 until 8 o'clock my time, and then we call it a day. And all other questions, just submit it on the feedback that we will send you a survey after the webinar. So, and we can discuss that. How would you enforce global business rules about uniqueness? Oh, that's a classic question, yes. I cannot answer that question because it always requires. So we need to understand that every domain is different and every situation is different. Sometimes and often I've been in a project that the business said that something, project number, whatever, and it must be unique. It's a classic case. And developers immediately started to implement this and came to me with this particular question. And I asked why. And they said, we don't know. That's the business requirement. And I said, okay, let's go to the business and ask them. And they say, yeah, because, well, it looks better when it's unique. And I said, will someone die when it's not unique? Will the sky will crash on Earth and there will be apocalypse? Or like, okay, let's go small scale. That's a big scale. Let's go small scale. Will the business lose money? Will be there inconsistencies? Whatever we cannot deal with later on, if it's not unique. I say, that's just, it's nice to have. Also, you need to see the cadency of like how often these things get into the system. How big is the chance that is like if you have eventually consistent read models and you control this kind of cross-boundary environment using read models. If you have SLA in your read model that is like 10 milliseconds or maybe like 1 second, and the elements go to your system less frequently, then you don't have a problem. So it's all about the SLAs. It's all about the real need to ensure that particular thing. There are tons of ways to do it, even with very hard, consistent guarantees. It is usually overkill, however. So I'd really advise you before you start doing the technical implementation of such technique, which we can do one of the following. Consider, one of the webinars in the future. We can look at this, some of the implementation patterns, but before you go there, start asking questions. Why is it important? Do we really need to do it? What will happen if it does? If it's not guaranteed? Or what if we get duplicates? And how often could it happen? So all these questions are important. So start talking to a business to understand the requirements really. So and follow up on the question, basically like what happens if you have 2 bookings and stuff like that? That happens all the time. So the overbookings and you arrive at the hotel. It happened to me several times. I arrived at the hotel. We have no place. We all booked. We called the nearby hotel, and you go there. It's even better than ours. So you don't pay a thing. You get a better service. It's all about the business. That's what I want to say. So don't strive to technically solve business problems. Business problems are solved by business people. Ask them what will happen if you kind of miss this guarantee. They might just say, oh, we have a procedure, or we have overbooking anyway. So talk to business. Since event streams are immutable, would you handle? Oh yeah, GDPR is the topic on its own. Simple answer that puts personal information to separate stream and delete it. That's a simple answer. The more complex answer, how to deal with that crypto deletion and physical deletion, stuff like that, we can discuss on either we publish a blog post. I think there will be a blog post about this. GDPR again. So what's the difference between messaging and event store? Event store stores events and they don't go away. A RabbitMQ doesn't store events. It doesn't store messages. It has durable queues. They stay there until they're consumed. As soon as they're consumed, they disappear. That's it. So RabbitMQ is perfect for messaging. It doesn't work for storage. Event store is a database. RabbitMQ is a messaging structure. It can be used with some tweaks as a messaging structure. I wouldn't advise you so. So just use whatever fits the tool. What options are available for running event store in the cloud? Yes, we announced that it's coming this year. Managed event store service will be there this year. So if you're interested, our marketing team is also interested to get in touch with those people who once who wants to get managed service. So get in touch. We'll be happy to help. Protobuf preferred way. Well, I'm not quite sure. I think protobuf and the versioning are kind of orthogonal concerns. So for event sourcing, it's important that you keep the version of the contract, that your domain event stays the same. So basically, you keep your stuff stable, and you can use pattern like weak schema, so you can add more properties that are not mandatory to events later on without breaking the contract. But overall, I don't think it's not technological concern. I think it's logical concern. So I think we need to spend another session talking about versioning as such, and then we can deal with this better. So let's postpone this. Is there effect? If the effect a command should change multiple aggregates? No, I wouldn't do that. The command, I would strongly advise the command actually operates on a single aggregate, because commands needs to have an idea on aggregate it will be operating on. If you have commands that operate on multiple aggregates, you have this risk of that is actually solved on the relational database, right? So you open a transaction, you close it at the end. But that violates the essence of the aggregate pattern. The aggregate pattern is a thing on its own. That's your transaction boundary. If you put a transaction and wrap multiple aggregates in one transaction, that basically doesn't make sense from the pattern perspective. We can discuss if pattern is useful or not, but this is the transaction boundary in the system that uses aggregates is the aggregate itself. So every operation aggregate should be atomic. And if you have multiplicity of operations, I would advise you to have this batched command, split it in multiple commands, set it through the matching structure, handle one by one, so you can have a guarantee of all of this being executed. If you need to do that and you can't find a way to split it, you probably need to deal with your boundaries. Probably your boundaries are wrong. Probably need to look at it again. Event store does not support saving event to multiple stream in one transaction. This was the question. No, it doesn't, and probably shouldn't. So fully managed option available. Yes, it will be fully managed option available later this year. So GDPR again. Did you stop VS Code up for the stream in any particular way? That's not VS Code, that's Rider. And look at the JetBrains website. It's a good company and good products. What are the plans to redo Event Store UI? Yes, there are plans. Well, the plan is to kill it. Oh, maybe I shouldn't say this, but that's the plan. So we probably get the same way as Mongo does. So CLI for the thing and desktop client or something like that. And for managed service, there will be probably some UI. But yes, I'm not also a fan of the UI, and there are plans to address it. And how drastic the plans are, it will be subject to change. Next webinar will be just keep in touch, answer our survey, please, provide the feedback. You love me, you hate me, need to improve my voice, stuff like that, I don't know. Tell it to us and also suggest topics. Oh, of course, the most obvious topic is to talk about read models, and the next could be GDPR, versioning, and whatever concerns. So we try to do it regularly, so like twice a month, something like that. Any recommendation how to approach DBAs who oppose non-CRUD approach? Well, yeah, I don't know. I was lucky enough not to deal with DBAs, and at one company that I need to deal with DBA, I had to leave. I think you need to get buy-in from the developer team, and if the DBA is not a part of the development team, they wouldn't have much to say. So I worked with companies that implement the approach that Eric Evans suggested a long time ago of using bubble context and autonomous bubble context to take out pieces of legacy and use strangler pattern to actually choke the old piece of legacy and just let it die. This is pretty useful because when you start doing things on the site, nobody really cares. So, but my strong opinion, DBA should not tell development team how to do things. This is up to the development team, and DBA is a supportive role. DBA needs to help the development team to do the queries optimal and not to kill the relational database. But DBA is kind of, I don't know. I would struggle to really get into that environment. I think it's holistic, it's hostile. Then when DBAs have something to say about the implementation, especially if the team chooses to do something else. Like, I remember in Twitter someone said, "We're not that cool to use Mongo." I said, "Yeah, Mongo is not really cool. I mean, it's just the tool, and if you want to choose the tool, why not choose the tool? I mean, what is the problem? Is there a management that tells you how to do stuff? Is there a DBAs how to do stuff? Is the CEO tells you how to do stuff? That's probably not the place where you want to be. I don't know, but maybe I was lucky." So really trying to go fast. If you have a card and product entities, would it have card products edited, contain state of a card plus card product, or every operation? Yeah, I would say this is about card products edited versus specific events. I would say specific events have very specific meaning. So you really want to avoid having situations when I, for example, want to look at the history for marketing purposes and understand what was added and then removed by going through and comparing booleans there. It's really not, when it's say, edited and changed, I feel CRUD. And I'm heavily opposed to CRUD in event source systems because it doesn't make much of a sense. So I hope I answered your question. Do you know if IBM DB2 event store is the same as event store functionality? Actually not. It's not. I know about the product and I look at it, and it's not the same. I don't exactly remember. I looked at it more than a year ago, but I found it very, very different. It is more. It's more similar to Kafka Streams, to be honest. So it's not really an event store as such. It's the place like data lake combined with high performance event processing, stuff like that. So, but you couldn't, and they have their own language and they have their own clients and stuff like that. You couldn't just go there and say, I shovel 50 events or one event to that stream. I don't remember even they have streams, and give me back this event. It doesn't work like that. It's completely different. It's called event store for some reason, but it's a different product. I think it's event processing more. So did you record a webinar? Yes, we did. And I wanted to record it on my streaming studio, and I forgot to click the button. Sorry about that, but it's recorded in Zoom. So we will publish the recording, and it's also recorded in the YouTube stream. And the last question, can I use Event Store in Java Spring application? Yes, you can. There is a client, JVM client. It's not written in Java, it's written in Scala, and it's a community contribution. But going forward, we plan to implement SDKs for most of the popular languages, including, of course, Java. So it will be the SDK supported by Event Store itself. But the client is there. So if you want just to play around, you might want to use it. And yeah, that's how it is. But we will do stuff. So I think C# is there, and Java will be coming, and I hope Go and Rust, JavaScript for Node, and then maybe Python, I don't know. So I managed to answer all the questions, and I just got 10 minutes over my own time limit and 40 minutes over time over the webinar. And I thank you all for coming. We will send you a survey, so please don't ignore us. We love you all. Please love us back, and see you next time. Thank you very much.